Welcome back. In the last video, we implemented a line trace going from the screen space location of our crosshairs deprojected to world space. We then used the hit result from that trace to set the beam end location and the impact particles so that we can direct bullet hits based on where we aim. Now, there's a slight problem we need to fix here, and we can see that problem if we drag in another cube. So I'm dragging in a cube from the basic panel. I'm going to move the cube up pretty high and set its material to default so it's gray. I'm going to do the same thing for the cube behind it. I'm going to set its material to default so it's also gray. This way we can see our beam particles. I'm going to scale it just a little thicker and hitting Alt-P to play. I'm going to aim just past the cube. And if you notice, the impact point is behind the first cube and the impact particles are spawning on the cube behind the first cube. But take a look at the beam particles. They're going through the first cube. They're not actually stopping at the first cube. This is because we're tracing from the screen location of the crosshairs instead of from the barrel location of the gun. Now, realistically, the smoke beam and the hit particles should hit the cube in front because the path from the gun barrel will hit the cube in front first. Now, the reason that the beam end location and impact location are on the cube behind it is because we're performing the line trace from the crosshairs location instead of the barrel location. We need to do that if we want our bullet to fly in the correct direction. However, we do need to make sure that if there's an object between the gun barrel and the point we're aiming at, we need to hit that object that lies between the gun barrel and our aiming point. So we're going to fix that in this video. So back in Visual Studio, in shooterCharacter.cpp, we're here in the fire weapon function. Now I'm going to scroll down a bit, all the way down to where we perform our line trace. Now remember, this is the line trace tracing outward from the crosshairs location to the world location that we're aiming at. If this blocking hit was successful, then we set our beam endpoint to be that hit location. Now after we trace for this, we also need to trace from our weapon barrel to the beam endpoint location. If there is an object between the gun barrel and the beam endpoint location, we need to change the bullet impact point so that it hits that object. So after we check to see if there was a trace hit, we're going to perform a second trace, and this one will be from the gun barrel. So let's make a comment that says, perform a second trace, this time from the gun barrel. Now we're going to create an F hit result, and we'll call this one weapon trace hit. Now the start for this trace hit is going to be the socket transform location. So we're going to say const f vector weapon trace start, and we'll initialize this with socket transform dot get location. Now this trace end will be the beam end location. So we're going to say const f vector weapon trace end, and this one will be initialized with beam endpoint. Now we can perform our line trace from the barrel of the gun to the beam endpoint. So we'll call getWorld line trace single by channel, and the first parameter is the weapon trace hit result. Next parameter is the start, which we called weapon trace start. Next is the end, which we called weapon trace end. We need our channel, which will be the visibility channel. So E collision channel ECC visibility. And the rest of the parameters have default values. So that's all we need. I'm going to give this the semicolon. Now, after we perform this trace, we need to check to see if we got a blocking hit. So if weapon trace hit dot be blocking hit, and we can comment this line here and say object between barrel and beam endpoint. If so, we need to set the beam endpoint to the trace hit location. So beam endpoint equals weapon trace hit dot location. So if there was an object between the barrel and the beam endpoint, we've changed our beam endpoint to the trace hit location where that object is. Now our beam particles that we spawn use the beam endpoint, but you'll notice up above when we got our first blocking hit, that's when we spawn our impact particles, but we shouldn't spawn those yet. Let's go ahead and copy this code where we spawn the impact particles and delete it. We need to make sure to call this after our second line trace just to make sure that those impact particles are using the beam endpoint after it's been updated if there was an object in the way. So we'll spawn those particles right here after our check for the second blocking hit. And for the location, we'll use beam endpoint. So let's comment this and say spawn impact particles after updating beam endpoint. Okay, so just as a recap, what we're doing in this function is first we did all that work to trace outward from the crosshairs location to the point in space we're aiming at. If there was a trace hit, then we set our beam endpoint to that location. But this is the trace hit location from the crosshairs straight out into the world. We also need to check to see if there's anything in between the gun barrel and that hit point. Because if there is something in the way, then we need to make sure to update our beam endpoint so we then perform a line trace from the gun barrel towards the beam endpoint. If it doesn't hit anything, then there was no object in the way. Now, if it does hit something, the beam endpoint is now the hit point on the object that got hit between the barrel and the point we're aiming at. So then we spawn the impact particles there, and we spawn the beam particles and set the vector parameter to the beam endpoint. Let's compile this. Okay, back in the editor, we're going to press play. We'll shoot first away from this object, and we'll see that the beam endpoint and the impact particles spawn appropriately. Now we'll go up to the object and aim just over the edge. And we'll see that the impact particles are hitting the edge of the object as they should, because this object rests just in the way between the barrel and the point on the wall we're aiming at. Our beam end also stops on the object that's in the way as well. This is how it should be, because if you're aiming just past something and the edge of the object is just in the way between the gun and what you're aiming at, your bullet should hit that object. So this concludes this video. We changed the aiming mechanics. Before we were performing a line trace from the crosshairs location straight out into the world, but now we're performing a second line trace from the barrel tip to the point we're aiming at. And if that line trace hits something, then we update our beam end location and our impact point to that new hit location. In the next video, we're going to look at refactoring our weapon trace code so that we can get it to look a lot more tidy and orderly. See you in the next video.